So, hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Biome podcast with Emma, Robi, Kate. And this week, we're really lucky to be joined by our awesome friend Alice. And we are going to talk about zoos. So again, another maybe controversial topic. Some people agree with them, some people don't. So we just really wanted to have a discussion with the four of us about kind of, what we think about zoos. Is it the same for kind of all animals, things like that. So part one will be talking to Alice, and then part two, me, Robi and Kate will go into a bit more of a discussion about zoos as a whole.
And so part of the reason the whole reason we've got Alice on, and apart from being our wonderful friend and fellow student at the University of Leeds, Alice actually works at a zoo at the moment. So how did you start working at the zoo, and what were your kind of thoughts and feelings going into that project?
So I applied to do a placement at this zoo, and I actually didn't apply to do anything animal-based, really. I wanted to approach it purely from a science communication point of view. I thought it'd be an interesting place to work, it'd be an interesting place to collect data. So that's originally what I applied for, and I was a bit skeptical of the idea of the rest of the zoo. I have always thought that zoos were kind of almost a necessary evil. But I guess I just decided that, I really wanted to explore the science communication side of a zoo, so I applied. COVID has changed my placement a lot, and I've got to see a lot more than I expected. And actually, it's really changed how I feel about zoos, and how I feel about how they run and how they work, and how much benefit they can provide.
So going into this placement at this zoo, what was your initial opinion, maybe in a bit more detail? What were the reservations, and what do you think that opinion had been influenced by? Because I know my opinion of zoos has been very much influenced by not only the fact that I've been to a fair few, but also by the fact that I've actually seen animals in the wild, which is a very lucky thing to have done. But I do understand that has kind of coloured my opinion of zoos quite extensively.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you there. So going into it, I've always loved going to zoos since I was a little kid. It was my favorite thing to do. And I went to I've been to a whole load all over the world. Whenever I went anywhere with my family, I was like, we're going to go to a zoo. Whatever zoo is closest, we're going to try it out. And I think I was always a little bit, as I grew up and I understood more about animals and conservation, how much I loved them. And, I watched David Attenborough and even had a few experiences in the wild with animals myself, I became a lot more critical of zoos. And I was walking around most of them, actually, before it was when I was a kid, oh, this is wonderful, this is great, look at the cute animals. Then it sort of became more does that cage really look big enough? Is this fair? Are they, with birds, say, are they clipping their wings? How are they stopping them flying? How are they restricting movement? How are they restricting escape? It just became a lot more cynical, I guess, my view of zoos. And sorry? Oh no,
sorry, just kind of to ask with that, do you think that's almost like a positive of zoos? Is it their aim to maybe make people question, as a kid you go, oh my god, this is incredible animals, yes, I want to go into conservation. But then down the line you realise, actually maybe they should be in the wild, maybe they should have bigger cages. Do you think that's the zoo's purpose in a way, to get people to question it all?
I think 100% a good zoo should be communicating that to you. And I think that's where a lot of them not fail, but they're really struggling because they're really getting a lot of pushback. I think with the rise of social media and everyone having access to all kinds of information, it's kind of easy to have your opinion swayed one way or another. And it's hard for zoos to get that message across. And that was one of the main things I found when I started working there. I was surprised by, I guess, how many complete animal lovers and animal nuts I was surrounded by, because I have a lot of animal lover friends, some of whom who were very oh, you're going to work at a zoo? Are you sure about that? Is that what you really want to do? But every single person who I've met, who I work with, cares so much about animals, about conservation, about the natural world. And I think they all realize that they're not in it for the money. They realize that the zoo is not meant to last forever. No one wants zoos to last forever, but we need them, I think, is the main point. Like right now we need them. We inherited them from this sort of like 19th century fascination with natural history and, you know, colonialism and people bringing all these exotic animals back and going, oh, look at this. And so we inherited these zoos, and it's kind of our moral obligation to improve them and do with them what we can while we need them.
How have you found, so obviously you've been at this zoo largely during the pandemic, and going into it you said you were quite focused on science communication. I assume that means kind of with the public, and has the zoo been open much during COVID, and have you managed to kind of see the benefits of the science communication, or has that been kind of tainted by the pandemic?
Yeah, unfortunately that has really been tainted by the pandemic. The science communication side was the first part to sort of shut down, because the issue with the zoo, I suppose, with the pandemic was that it costs a lot of money to feed and look after animals, and all of their money really had to go to that. There wasn't room to be running campaigns and education days and all the stuff that they would love to be doing, because every single penny had to be ensuring that those animals had the highest welfare they could offer. So I definitely haven't seen as much of that as I would like to, but I have seen their plans, and I've researched other zoos' plans to help give them some ideas for the future. So I feel like even though I haven't been directly involved in it, I've really seen what it could do and what it could be. And I think that there's a lot to explore there in terms of how we can make zoos even more educational than they already are.
And so building on that then, what in your mind, as someone who is currently working at a zoo, what is kind of for you the greater purpose and the most important goal of any zoo? Because for a lot of people the answer, I imagine, is probably different. You'd probably get some people who say, oh, it's captive breeding of endangered species, or you'd get some people who would say it's public engagement in wildlife, and some people and some zoos would certainly say it's for profit. So in your experience, what is the kind of the key aim that you think that a zoo should have?
Okay, so I think the concept of the modern zoo is based on three main pillars, and that's education, conservation, and welfare. And I think everything that you just said does play a factor. I mean, profit will always play a factor, because any kind of institution, whether it's a school, a shop, a restaurant, has to make some kind of profit to be able to improve. It's just how it works. So every single one of those things plays a part. But I think if you ask anyone involved in any kind of really decent zoo establishment, and there are lots in the world that aren't decent, and those we do have a problem with, but a good zoo should be based on education, conservation, and welfare. So that's educating the public in why we need them, why they're important, also just other things like how to live a sustainable lifestyle, how to help animals in distress. I mean, one of the projects that they run at the zoo that I work at is sort of how to build hedgehog houses and things like that, like how to look after the wildlife in your back garden. So education in that way, conservation in that a lot of the species that will be at zoos, and a lot of the species that should be at zoos, are ones that are endangered and ones that really need a solid conservation effort and a solid breeding program to help them out in the wild. And then welfare, and that's just ensuring that the animals that are in the zoo's care are getting the best possible care, they're living the best possible lives, because no one wants them in that zoo. Everyone would rather have them in the wild. All the keepers that I work with, they love these animals like they were their pets or their children, and they want the best possible outcome for them. So ensuring that they get the best diet, the best space, exercise, that they're performing all of their natural behaviors that indicate happiness. Those are all things that are key and crucial to a modern zoo.
And so the natural follow-up to that, you mentioned those three pillars. It's very easy for we three who don't work in a zoo to be quite idealistic about our opinions of zoos. But as someone who perhaps has a more pragmatic outlook because you actually work there, Is there any room for one of those three pillars to take precedence, or must it, in your view, must it be complete equal in terms of the resources devoted to them, the money that goes into them, and that sort of thing?
I think it does have to be equal, because they all play such an important role. So conservation, for instance, I mean, there are some species, I think there are 32 species worldwide that are extinct in the wild but exist within zoos. So those species don't have a chance outside of breeding programs through zoos and other, wildlife establishments. So their conservation, you couldn't put more importance on that than the animal going extinct forever. So conservation is hugely important. Equally, it is, as I say, a moral and ethical obligation if you're going to keep those animals, to keep them in the best possible standards. If you're trying to save a species, it's no good like putting them in a 4x4 concrete cage, because they're probably not going to want to breathe. They're probably not going to want to eat. They're probably not going to want to do anything. And then finally, education. I think education maybe, I don't think it's the least important by any means, but education is where it ties into the public and where it ties into profit. Because if to conserve animals, to look after them properly, you need money, and to get money, you need visitors. So if you're going to be putting these things on display anyway, you need to be educating people as to why you're doing that. Why are we putting this one particular species on display? Why do we have this species in the zoo? But also the bigger picture of why do species need protection? Why is it that they can't exist in their natural habitats? Is it poachers? Is it climate change? Is it any number of other things?
There's so many. They're all
our
fault
many,
usually.
literally so many human-based problems. So it's really, really important to communicate that, because if you don't, then you're not engaging the public. They're just walking around going, oh, look at these pretty animals, and that's not good enough. They need to realize why they're there, or the whole point of it. It's almost pointless to be doing it in the first place if everyone else doesn't understand why you're doing it. So I would say that all three of them carry a huge amount of weight and can't exist without the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I would fully agree, and I think it's just, like you say, if you don't have that wider conservation perspective, people are just going to walk around and have that, cute animal, and then just keep moving. So I think that is almost a crucial role that zoos can play. I guess we're going to talk a bit about this a little bit more in part 2, but with regards to different species, do you think that your opinion is the same for all species? Do you think that all species should be kept in zoos? Is it just some? Does your opinion change depending on what species it is?
I think so, and maybe not in the way that you might think, because I think a lot of people say higher mammals shouldn't be kept in zoos, and I am a very big believer that whales and dolphins should not be kept in not so much zoos but attraction parks. And I think so, yeah, there's a lot of that kind of, well, if they're really intelligent, they don't belong in a zoo, and I think there is some truth to that, but it's also, how endangered are they in the wild, and how much is having them there going to have a real impact on the people, the public for one, and the people that are trying to protect them. My opinion actually changes slightly depending on how well we can provide welfare. For instance, gorillas, a lot of people are like, oh, well, they're very smart and they shouldn't be in zoos because they're so smart, they're almost like humans. But actually it's really easy to provide gorillas good welfare because we know they're so smart. At the zoo where I work, we have games for them to play, really intricate puzzle games, and they love it. And they have plenty of space and plenty of toys. I mean, it's easy to keep them stimulated if you know what you're doing, and we do, because there's been a lot of research. On the flip side, a lot of the animals that people shove into zoos are almost filler animals. They're never the main attractions. So reptiles and fish, a lot of amphibians. I think that there's some debate there. I think right now we really need to improve their welfare if we're going to justify keeping them in zoos. their welfare has been largely ignored, and that's fair enough because there's not been a huge amount of research to suggest that they need welfare. But I think more and more it's becoming obvious that they do, that they can detect pain, that they can have some kind of emotional response. I use that word pretty lightly. But I think, shoving a snake in a tank half its size was once, oh, well, it's fine. What does the snake know? But I think now it's becoming clear that these animals need better welfare or they shouldn't be in zoos. So that's kind of my take on it, less so about how intelligent the animals are, but more about how well we can provide for them in the zoo setting.
That's a really interesting take on it, actually. I'd never really thought about how you might that viewpoint might be kind of lost when you visit a zoo, because I remember really clearly visiting a zoo where there was a cheetah enclosure, and outside the cheetah enclosure were footprints like on the tarmac where you stood, showing you like the maximum length of a cheetah's stride when it was fully running at full speed, and those two footprints were wider than the enclosure was. And I remember being aghast and thinking, oh, this is awful, this mammal, you can't do this to a mammal. And yet I also remember, I think in every zoo I've ever been to, just going through the reptile house and seeing a Komodo dragon in a tank the size of my bed and thinking, oh, okay, well, it's a Komodo dragon. So that's really, really fascinating, actually.
And if you actually think about it, when we have these larger mammals and these more intelligent mammals, yes, they're more aware of what's going on. They might be more aware of the fact that they're confined, but they're also being constantly monitored for their welfare and at a good zoo at least, constantly given environmental enrichment. So the zoo I work at, we do cheetah running, and they attach a chicken or something, not a dead chicken, not a live chicken, that's a welfare issue itself, to this sort of run, and then they move it around so that the cheetahs get to run and chase and it's good for them, it's fun for them, it stimulates their minds and their bodies. So you could argue in that sense that cheetah's probably, he's like, oh, well, I don't think they can actually tell that they're in a zoo, but to simplify it, he's like, oh, well, I'm in a zoo, but at least I get to have fun. Whereas a frog, we don't think of frogs as needing welfare, and we don't really understand much about them. So that frog is probably going to be worse off sitting in a tiny little cage, even if it doesn't have the same emotion, the same mental capacity as the cheetah. Because no one's doing anything for it at all. It just sits there all day.
Riveting. Mournfully riveting, thinking, oh, I pine for the pond wherein I used to live.
I think I'm sorry. No, you go.
I was just going to say, that's not to say that it's not improving and that some zoos don't do it well and do actually, the reptile keepers at my zoo care greatly about their reptiles just as much as they think of them as their children just as much as the gorilla keepers do, and they do everything to ensure that they have enrichment. So it's not to say that zoos can't, it's just to say that generally it tends to be more overlooked.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you say that welfare is such a key part, it's one of the 3 pillars, and it's really lovely to hear that the zoo that you're at, that you feel that the staff will really, really care, and I'm sure they do. I can imagine when you're spending that much time with these animals, you do develop a bond. It sounds like where you are is a really great zoo, but often zoos are criticised because of welfare issues, more so than kind of educational conservation. And have you experienced any criticism, and how do you feel about public criticism towards zoos?
I think what I would say is it's very easy to judge, because that's what I did before coming in. Even at the zoo that I currently work at, and I've worked with other safari parks and that in the past, and I've been judgy of some of their enclosures. I've thought, if I did this, I could do it better. But I think from seeing it from the inside, it's important to realize that they're doing all they can. And again, this isn't true of all zoos. There are some really awful zoos in the world, and I think it's not hard to tell what those are if you look for it, and those should be avoided. You should not support those institutions. Likely they are just in it for the money. But at a good zoo, it might not always seem like the best. I think the biggest criticism I can think of would probably, I'm not going to name any names or anything, of a zoo that I have worked with, not necessarily that I'm working at, was that the tiger enclosure was particularly small, and several of my friends had mentioned that to me. And I know that visitors would mention that. It's like, oh, it's a real shame because they're such big cats. But they're working with what they've got, and you can be sure that behind the scenes they are doing everything they can to ensure the best welfare. And it's not always ideal, and they might think that it's not always ideal either. But they'll 100% be trying their best.
I guess it's important to remember that if you as a member of a public come in and notice a fault and notice a criticism, it's more than likely that the people who work there being trained in animal welfare are aware of it, and even if they can't do something about it, they might put a bit more effort into enrichment or to try and kind of balance that out, I always think.
Yeah, no, like definitely. And I think also it can just come from being a bit too judgy, maybe thinking misconceptions on what exactly is needed. I remember someone once said to me, a friend of my brother's, he said, he found out I was working at a zoo, and he said, oh, I live right by that zoo, and I've never heard the lions roar, and surely that must be a welfare, like they must be so sad if they don't roar, like I live right next to it, I'd hear it if they roar. I mean, I sit in an office which is, I don't know, across the zoo from where the lions are, and I hear them roar, but I don't hear them roar like properly, because obviously there are variations of the sounds that lions make, and the really aggressive roars are defending their territory, and when you're in a zoo you don't need to defend your territory. So yeah, they're not going to do it like that. But in his head it was like, oh, they must be so upset, they must be so awfully looked after because I've never heard them roar. So I just thought that was quite funny, because that's just like a simple misconception that someone's made.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think it kind of feeds into why you kind of need all three pillars in kind of equal measure, as you said, because the education is so important. And I think often with animal welfare in zoos and in other instances, people, they look and they think, oh, an animal in captivity, that must be bad. That must be the worst thing because it's not natural or it's not in the wild. But actually, people don't necessarily know what is the best thing or the right thing for that animal. And so if you think a lion's not roaring, you kind of think in your head, oh, he must be sad, when actually you don't know that. I'm sure that person hasn't studied lion vocalisms or like lion behavior much before. And it's so you kind of need the educational element to come running straight behind the welfare and saying, by the way, this is what this means and this is what this means, and that's why you need kind of all three.
I guess that's kind of just shows again how even zoos, which are at the heart of a lot of conservation, that interaction with the public is again an area where your shifting of your baseline might trip you up, especially with an emotional response. So I remember I went to a zoo once with my parents, and I think it was my dad. I'm not entirely sure. Definitely one of them. I was quite young. Made a comment that, I wonder how the lions feel living in the UK, because it was a zoo in the UK. And I remember that colouring my impression of that zoo for quite a while, because I was like, it's good, but they should live in Africa, which completely ignores the fact that 10,000 years ago we had lions in the UK. They bred very happily here. Yeah, it was a different paleo subspecies, but lions used to be spread across the entirety of Eurasia, living in temperate oak woodland that we have here today. And, I think it might be quite easy sometimes to let that colouring trip you up without realising that actually a species' native habitat now we may consider it native because either that's where we've forced it because we've pushed it out of the rest of its range, or that a lot of animals are quite flexible, and give them enough enrichment and enough welfare, and the vast majority might be able to live quite happily in quite a few places.
But I also think we is that the word, anthropomorphize
Yeah.
animal feelings very, very often. So like you were saying, Alice, with the gorillas, it's like in my head when I see gorillas in a zoo, I feel like they would be happier in the Congo or Virunga or like wherever they're naturally found. But maybe for those specific animals, they're happy with that enrichment. They're there doing their puzzle. They're like, oh, mentally stimulated. And I think, yeah, humans are very, I don't know if it's a negative or a positive trait that we just imprint our own feelings onto other animals. And I think that can cloud how we see animals in zoos and just think they're automatically unhappy.
Yeah, I think that is definitely an issue, as it were, because we don't know. Like, we have no idea. Like, these, going back to gorillas, like, these gorillas have never lived outside of a zoo, which I think some people would be like, oh, that's really sad. But they don't know any different. And, yeah, at the end of the day, because we don't know, the best place for them is their natural habitat. However, that's not, like, gorillas can live to, like, 70. You're just gonna ship back the gorillas that have, lived the first 4 years of their life in a zoo and getting fed every day at the same time and playing with toys, and suddenly you're just gonna dump them in the rainforest somewhere and be like, have fun.
They probably wouldn't make it, would they?
We don't know how animals feel, and I think it is dangerous to try to push our own feelings onto them. That is not to be said that we should get complacent about it. Like I say, because we don't know, the place they should be is their natural habitat, but we don't live in a perfect world. We have a lot of animals. At my zoo they have a tortoise that is going on 100, and yeah, a lot of animals that have legacies in zoos. You can't just give them all back because you think it's the right thing to do. We don't know how they feel, so all we can do is what's best for them in terms of welfare and what's best for them in terms of the survival of the species.
And it's interesting.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's interesting your point about we don't know how they feel, but at the same time, because we're potentially closer to some of the higher mammals, actually we might be providing a greater quality of care than we do, to reptiles. And I remember when I was doing a zookeeper training course once, we went and saw the keeper who was in charge of these 2 West African dwarf crocodiles. And he was a really interesting guy to talk to. And he said, I've been spending the last 6 months trying to get inside the heads of these 2 West African dwarf crocodiles, because it's my job to try and get them to mate so that their offspring can go back into the wild. And he said, I've been trying to do it for 6 months, and in the end, it wasn't anything I did. They just got bored with me trying to stimulate them and just went off and mated. And I remember thinking at the time, oh wow, we really don't know how West African dwarf crocodiles feel, do we?
No, I think trying to figure it out is a bit hopeless almost. It's like it just reminds me of, so my mum with my dog, she's always like, she'll come down in the morning, and if he has a certain look, she'll be like, I think he's peed somewhere or something. He looks guilty. He looks really guilty. And I read an interesting paper on it, because that puppy dog look that dogs have, that little thing where they turn up their little eyebrows and go, is most likely an evolutionary trait, because it makes them look really cute, and we feel they're playing on our emotions there, because we're less likely to abandon them or hurt them, because we're like, oh, it looks like us, it looks cute, it has emotions like us. So that's something they've evolved to have over time. They're like literally playing us, because we're imprinting our emotions onto them. But that doesn't mean that they feel that. And that with dogs is very obvious, because when it comes to dog training, the only really successful way of training a dog is positive reinforcement. Mm-hmm. And if they actually did have a good understanding of our emotions, negative reinforcement would work as well, but it doesn't, because they don't. They just pretend that they do.
That's a very good point, yeah. And I'll bear it in mind next time I see a West African dwarf crocodile giving me the puppy eyes. And I'll think, hang on, you're playing me here. You want me to come down to the water so you can...
Yeah, I think this raises kind of another interesting point about zoos. As much as we don't know how animals feel and what they think, and we probably never will to the full extent, one of the kind of big things that we can do with zoos is to study animals close up, which we can't necessarily do in the wild for safety reasons. And have you found that have you got any experience of that where you've kind of felt like you've learnt more about these animals from seeing them kind of close up every day?
Yeah, I think I can't think of a sort of exact example off the top of my head, but I just know from the amount of research that just crosses the desk of, say, my boss in a week, in a year. I have access to one of our research emails, and the amount of requests that come pouring in. Everyone is desperate to work with these animals, and we have gained so much knowledge. Nearly everything that we know about exotic species, as it were, comes from zoos. Like stuff that you can't get through an observational study. And a lot of that work has really benefited the then conservation work that they're doing to try to save these species, because the more we know about them, the more we know about how they work, how they behave, and their diets, and what's good for them, what's not. It all comes from studies in zoos.
And I guess the one that springs to my mind is carpies, which obviously live in the deepest, darkest depths of the Congo, where it's A, really hard to find them, B, really hard to go. And almost the entirety of our knowledge about their biology, their dietary biology, their reproduction, which is really key for conservation, all comes out of captive carpies and zoos, which is kind of the example I would give for that.
Yeah, I think eyes is another great one to look at, because eyes are, I don't know exactly where they fall on the endangered scale, but they're regularly hunted and killed in Madagascar because of the belief that they are demons. A lot of the native people believe that they're demons. It's not hard to see why.
They're very odd looking.
They're odd. But because of that, and because they live in such thick, dense rainforests, and they're so small and they're nocturnal, they're really hard to study. So trying to communicate to a native population that you don't need to be worried of something that you can't really see, and when you do, it's really, really creepy. It's hard. And so it's much easier to study them in a zoo setting, because they can be in the dark, and we have infrared cameras and stuff to study them, and you don't really need to interact with them. You just watch them and watch what they're doing. And the more we learn about their behavior and what they are as animals, the more it's easier to communicate that they are not in fact demons and want to kill people. It makes it I guess if you go and see an eye in a zoo, if you were a native Madagascan and you go and see an eye in a zoo and watch it playing with a tennis ball, which I have seen an eye do, you're going to be like, oh, that's not going to kill me. Not saying that that's what happens, but it's a good example of how an animal that isn't seen very regularly in the wild has a very bad reputation in its native community, can be understood through study in a zoo setting.
And I think sorry.
No, okay, I'll go quickly.
Okay.
So I guess a flip side to that, though, is maybe seeing animals in zoos can give this misconception of how they actually are and how they behave in the wild. So I know a lot of people will leave zoos, have a really, really close encounter with an animal, like less than 5 meters away, and then as a child, especially, you might think, oh, okay, well, that's normal. Like, I can get that close to wildlife and it didn't hurt me. Or look how tame they are. Look how friendly they are. They look so happy. And I think that has kind of also led to that attitude that some people, I know, Alice, we've talked about this before, but the attitude some people have of like, well, why can't you just like let them all go? Like, why can't you just, they'd be okay if you just let them all go? Or then that attitude of like making people want one, because they feel like they're no threat, they could own them as a pet. Like, if zoos can have them, I feel that sometimes translates to individuals being like, well, why can't I own one myself? And then you've got celebrities, crazy celebrities, who then feed into that, who have these exotic animals, which they shouldn't.
Although you could probably make the argument that that's the fault of kind of human perception and social media, as opposed to the fault of the zoo. That's how I would kind of think about that point. Yeah.
That is, it's certainly one of the wildlife and pet trade is definitely something that all good zoos are thinking about. I mean, because the kind of, if you go trace zoos back to their sort of origin, as it were, like I say, it was a lot of 19th century Victorian fascination with natural history, but a lot of that came from the fact that kings and queens and czars and whatnot were owning bears and tigers and lions to show off. It was a power thing, and it still is, and it's become a real issue of wealthy people wanting something bigger and better than their friend, effectively, which means that there is a large amount of trade of endangered species, or just species that you should never attempt to keep in a house.
big cats spring to mind.
Yes, white tigers.
Absolutely. You should never try to. And yeah, I think it's a problem that all good zoos are aware of, and they're aware that they don't perpetuate it, but it is easy to forget that these are wild animals, especially when they have been in captivity for that long, when they have built up a sort of relationship with their keepers. They're not that afraid of humans. And you've got to remember, this doesn't just happen in zoos. There is evidence all over the world of people and animals getting along really well, side by side, forming relationships. A story of a dolphin from my Latin classes when I was like 13 comes to mind, of this boy who made friends with this dolphin, and I think it's based on real Latin texts. It's back from the Roman Empire, and this boy just made friends with this dolphin, and like it would let him ride it and stuff, which obviously you don't know how true that is, but there's always been evidence of this. It's not that wild animals can't form relationships with humans, it's just that they're not dogs, they're not cats, they haven't been bred for this. They have complex needs that you probably could meet if you had a hell of a lot of money, but chances are you're probably not, and that, again, we don't know how they're feeling, and so we should put them where they belong. At the end of the day, like I said before, we don't know how they're feeling, therefore by default they should be in their natural habitat, unless you're trying to save the species through conservation, or you cannot return them to their natural habitat. They should definitely not be kept in homes ever.
And I think the exotic pet trade is an episode of this podcast we've got coming up where we will do a whole massive tangent into, bush babies on TikTok and things like that, which we should definitely get into. Yeah. So maybe one quick thing before we move on to part 2. I can't remember the last time I went to a zoo. Obviously, with COVID, has kind of just taken a whole year out of all our lives, and 2019 feels like yesterday because I haven't done anything all year. But what's happening now? What's the new thing? How are zoos moving forward in the modern day? Because my idea of a zoo is probably 3 years out of date now. I must be so behind. What's the new thing that's happening here?
I think a big thing for a lot of zoos is sustainability. They are realizing that for a lot of people, they are the focal point of conservation, especially zoological societies. So think like Zoological Society of London, stuff like that. That for most people, they're a really good authority on conservation. No matter how you feel about zoos, most people will agree that the work that they do is very good, very important. And therefore, they also want to be leaders in sustainability. And I think that's important. If you're pushing a message of conservation and saving wildlife, you need to be pushing a message of fight climate change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's where a lot of, again, the good institutions are realizing that's where they need to be. They need to be leaders on sustainability. I know personally the zoo I'm working at we're coming up with a 30-year plan on going carbon neutral, going waste free, all of these kind of things. And I think that's where most zoos should be going. On the other side, so like conservation, welfare, we're starting to think about these animals that we're trying to save, do they have somewhere to go home to? So it's not just about a breeding program anymore. It's about working with, if you're trying to breed lions, or tigers, are you working with somewhere that's trying to protect them and protect their natural habitat so that they have somewhere to go home to one day? Because that's everyone's dream that works at a zoo, really, that we won't need them, that they'll all that in a few generations time they'll be back in the wild and zoos can close their doors.
I think to me that's very positive, knowing that that's happening, because like you, Robi, I don't know, there's something that I'm not hugely comfortable going to zoos because I'm not sure how I'm going to feel with the enclosure side of things, but knowing how much is going on behind the scenes and pushing for a more sustainable future, that encourages me a little bit, that they have moved on and they are now more places of, like you were saying, those three pillars like education and well-being, and then moving forward with sustainability. I think that's very positive for the future of zoos.
Yeah, it's definitely lovely to hear. I think that's a really nice way to kind of end this part of the zoos topic. Thank you so much, Alice, for your time and your insights. I've definitely learned a lot from you there, and I've really enjoyed hearing your perspective. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been really great to join you and talk to you. The one thing I'd just like to sort of end it with is COVID has hit zoos really hard, really hard. As I say, it's not cheap to look after animals. So what I would encourage anyone to do is support your local zoo, as long as make sure it's a good zoo. And most of the zoos in this country are doing really good things, but support them. Go for a visit, wander around, and if you have issues, if you think about it, if you see something and you're not sure, ask someone. I mean, a lot of the people who work there will be so happy to talk to you for hours about their animals. So just ask. But yeah, it's in this time more than ever, if you care about conservation, you care about animals, and you have the means to, I definitely say support your local zoo. It's really worth it. And yeah, if you're helping to protect those animals.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important thing to add.
So yeah, thank you so much for that insight into zoos. I think we all learnt so much from that. I hope you guys did as our listeners, viewers as well. So that was the end of part 1. We're now going to talk about zoos in a bit more depth between me, Robi and Kate.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for listening. And if you want to catch up and stay up to date with all the Biome content, please visit our website, which is www.biome-project.co.uk. And if you want to check us out on Instagram individually, we are Robi Watkinson's Wildlife, Emma Hodson Wildlife, and Conservation Kate. And we all post conservation and wildlife and environmental content on there as well.
And yeah, we will see you next time.